Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion hosted by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're here to delve into an extremely important and timely topic, China's power play and understanding this UN Resolution 2758. This resolution was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1971, and it has a lot of implications, not just for Taiwan's international status, but just China's influence in global governance more broadly. I'm Michael Beckley. I'm the director of the Asia program at FPRI. Thank you to our supporters and members. After I introduce the speakers and as we're talking, I'll be taking questions for our esteemed guests from the audience. So if you have something to ask, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box and I will work it in to the discussion. So we have the privilege of having two of really the leading experts on not just this particular resolution, but really China's role in global governance broadly. One of our speakers is well known to the FPRI community. We have Jacques deLisle, who is the Stephen A. Kozin Professor of Law, and he's also a professor of political science and a director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China, all at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's also the grand chair of the Asia program here at FPRI. And as many of you well know, he's a leading expert on Chinese law and politics, and his insights, of course, are going to be very important for our discussion today. And then our second speaker coming in all the way from the other side of the world is Dr. Courtney Fung, who is an associate professor in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University. Dr. Fung is also a non-resident fellow at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. She's affiliated with the Asia Society at Australia, as well as the Lowy Institute. And she's done extensive research on China's influence in international institutions. She has written a fantastic book on China's role in the United Nations, and she's going to help us provide a sort of deeper understanding of how China involves itself and shapes global governance to suit its interests, and then we'll apply that to the situation over Taiwan. So in the discussion today, we're going to hit on a number of key issues. We'll examine some of the historical context and the legal foundations for this UN resolution. And then we'll talk more broadly about how China has interpreted and utilized not just this resolution, but a series of acts within global governance to try to limit Taiwan's international space and advance Beijing's interests. And we'll talk about basically the implications for global governance and the so-called rules-based order. So as many of you might know, Jacques has written an excellent report recently on this particular UN resolution along with Bonnie Glaser. And so Jacques, I thought I'd start with you to help introduce the topic of the day. So for those of us who are not following the minutiae of what's been going on at the United Nations, could you maybe start by giving us a brief overview of UN Resolution 2758, maybe provide a little bit of the historical backdrop, how the resolution came about and what its original intentions were, and then we can maybe delve into some of the more contemporary applications.
Well, thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. And for that small portion of our audience that has not committed 2758 to memory, I'll give you a quick overview. It basically was adopted in 1971 by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And China's view now is that it settles the question of Taiwan's status. That's a rather far cry from where the resolution started out and what it actually says. And I think it's best read as essentially settling the question of what government, the government of the People's Republic of China, which of course ruled from Beijing at that point and still does, or the government of the Republic of China, which used to rule the mainland and then retreated to Taiwan in 1949, which one of those governments can hold the Chinese seat at the UN, can represent the ongoing member state of China in the UN context. And the context here, of course, is the UN was changing in those days. We were seeing new members being added with the wave of decolonization, the states that we now call the Global South. Obviously, China-Soviet Union relations had headed quite a quite negative direction. And so there was that sort of context. And the U.S. for years had resisted this kind of change, backing the ROC government in Taiwan. But the handwriting was sort of on the wall. The numbers were no longer there as more and more states engaged with China. So this resolution comes up. And in China's view now, it serves the One China principle, but at the time, that wasn't the Chinese view. There's a conversation between Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, who at that point was prior foreign minister and premier of China, in which Zhou says that the resolution as currently drafted does not settle the Taiwan question. And if you look at the text, Taiwan's not even mentioned. What it does is restore, ostensibly, the rights of the PRC to participate in the United Nations and expels the forces of Chiang Kai-shek, which had illegally occupied or unlawfully occupied that space. Of course, as with all votes in multi-member institutions, sort of legislative-looking institutions, it's hard to know exactly what was in everyone's mind. But for a fair number of the members, 30 or so, there were statements this was seen as simply a representation question. That is, who gets to represent China, rather than a question of whether Taiwan had separate membership or the qualifications for separate membership. And it would have been beyond the powers of the UN General Assembly to decide any kind of membership question. The way the UN works, membership is determined jointly by the Security Council and the General Assembly, and this was never put through the Security Council process. In later years, we saw Taiwan occasionally attempt to join, and that was rebuffed, but it went through that other process. Now, one of the difficulties for Taiwan in all of this is at the time the resolution was adopted, Beijing and Taipei shared the view that there was definitively one government of China. It was just a question of which one. Obviously, positions in Taiwan have evolved somewhat in the decades since.
And could you, before I turn to Courtney to give us some of the broader perspective on China's role in global governance, could you just say a bit more on that, Jacques, on how China has wielded this resolution 2758 to strengthen its one China policy, and how Taiwan has interacted with that as it's started to carve out a separate identity? And in particular, what legal arguments does Beijing use to support its stance?
Well, it certainly increasingly invoked 2758 as the basis for a position that it has held more broadly, which is there is but one China, and it includes Taiwan, and the sole government of that one China is in Beijing. But basically, what you see is this invocation of 2758 and an invocation of legal interpretations from within the United Nations. So there's an Office of Legal Affairs, essentially the legal council within the UN, which has put out a couple of memoranda, one of which the PRC now cites in its recent its 2022 white paper on Taiwan, that basically says the UN has sided with China on this, has adopted something akin to China's one China principle, and then China sort of puts that in a variety of contexts, including getting statements from other states that sort of accept this and getting the UN agencies to take that position. But it's a little oblique. That is, we see sort of somewhat conclusory statements that the General Assembly Resolution 2758 somehow settles the question, and there's an attempt to link it to broader principles of international relations and so on. But it, I think, ultimately plays into a broader argument about Taiwan's lack of international status. And this, of course, is the game. And so when you see the PRC government essentially poaching diplomatic allies, right, that's a way of driving down Taiwan's international space. It looks less like a state, keeping Taiwan out of a variety of international organizations, especially those that require state member-only membership. Again, trying to get some version of the one China principle into communiques and statements of establishing diplomatic relations. These are all matters of essentially China getting others in the world to sign on to this principle that Taiwan's status is settled and is definitively part of China.
Okay, before we delve a bit more into China's one China principle and other policies that it's utilized through the UN, Courtney, I was wondering if you could discuss the PRC's influence more broadly in the UN. You've written one great book on Chinese intervention at the UN Security Council, and you, from what I understand, another one is about to come out, China and Global Security Governance, which seems very apropos of the broader topic that we're discussing. So I'm wondering if you could fill us in on everything else that China has been doing, especially at the United Nations, how its leadership has evolved and grown, especially in UN specialized agencies. And then if you could tie that to Taiwan's participation and its representation in international organizations and whatever success the PRC has had in both upping its own status and trying to exclude Taiwan.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And I'm delighted to be here in conversation with yourself and with Jacques. So I think there's a few things to remember when we talk about the PRC, China, and its role in the UN system. Of course, China is a veto player at the UN Security Council. It's the second largest budget funder through the regular budget stream, so that covers about a third of all UN costs. So China's clocking in at ballpark 16% of the regular budget at the moment. And we also have to remember that rhetorically, at least, China is now committed to viewing itself and presenting itself as upholding true multilateralism. So it's part of a group of friends for the UN Charter, which have a much more fundamentalist, state-centric view on what the UN should be doing. So it should be a by states, for states organization in China's sort of best preference outcome. Of course, though, the UN itself has evolved over time, and now it is very much focused on trying to provide, individual security through peace and security initiatives, through human rights, and through development. So as part of China's push to make the claim that it is a true multilateralist and it is also a global public goods provider, China has now been producing over time more and more language, really sort of focusing on the role of the UN in China's greater foreign policy views and its greater foreign policy toolkit. And so even now, if you look at these different global public goods, there's actually quite a few, but they've got three that they've elevated to primacy, along with the BRI. So the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and most recently, the Global Civilization Initiative, of which these three are seen as matching the UN three-pillar structure. So GSI for peace and security, GCI for human rights, and GDI for the development pillar. So China's approach, and again, it's a very strong state-centric, little to say about, international human rights, little to say on human rights in general, and very much focused on making sure that there's gradual change and not abrupt, broader conceptions of liberal nation building. But I think in all of this, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Okay. But I think in all of this, though, as much as I'm giving you sort of the headline, sort of big picture, I think we also have to remember that as China's operating, it's thinking about its inputs it can give into the system. So these particular global public goods might have some financial arrangements tied to them. There also is the language in which China can try and input and shape the way that we understand global governance to occur. So simply by repeatedly talking about these global public goods, we're almost speaking them into existence as if China's contributions are large, in all aspects of, UN Security Council, General Assembly, UN business. Of course, though, there are other types of public goods that China wants to also add. And I think you've touched upon this in your question, this issue of staffing. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at staffing numbers by sort of national benchmarks, China is actually way below its, national benchmark footprint. And so this has been something now that Chinese officials are very keen to work on at all levels. So from, average UN worker all the way to the top when you look at sort of the executive leaders of various UN agencies. Now we can take a subset, and there are 15 UN specialized agencies, which at one point a couple of years ago, China was heading 4 out of the 15. So the only state to have multiple UN agencies under its leadership. So at that point, it was, heading the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, alongside the UN Industrial Development Organization and the International Labor Organization. And then it had added on competitions for other agencies that it did not win. So I think that's the first point to note, that China does compete and does not always succeed. The key thing here, though, is that Chinese elites are becoming clearer that they don't view these international civil servants as simply technical experts, international technocrats going about their job following Article 100 of the UN Charter. They are very clear that they're looking to send Chinese patriots that should be offering Chinese solutions for global governance problems. Now, I think that type of language has really set some states to really pay attention now to what China is doing, and hence now the competition for these posts are getting more and more difficult. China's had an unsuccessful run, for example, at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. Now, I think to tie it back to the Taiwan question, there is this view that once you have Chinese international civil servant heads, they will somehow help facilitate Chinese views, Chinese government positions they will help facilitate their entry into the UN system. So while I've talked all about these competitions to the specialized agency point, we also have to remember that P5 veto-wielding permanent members of the Security Council, there is an informal practice that they each head one particular UN agency. So at the moment, China has been heading the Department of Economic and Social Affairs for over 3 decades. And I think this is one of these very good examples of how when you manage the day-to-day operations and set the strategic direction of an agency, there is a lot of sleight of hand in which fungibility in which you can help policy run. So I think Jacques talks about this in his report with Bonnie. And, there's a very detailed case about the way that DESA collects information on development outcomes and the way that states can report their development achievements against the Sustainable Development Goals. And there has been a spat over time about the way in which Taiwanese support for individual development initiatives in individual states can be recognized and reported through the DESA portal, and therefore publicized, and the name that is applied to Taiwan in this particular case. I think that's seen as one of the closer examples of a firmer grip. But I think we also have to remember that even the cases of these MOUs signed between UN agencies and Chinese government agencies, of which I should note again, there is not a public list provided, so we don't really have a full sense of the number of these MOUs signed. Some of these MOUs are signed preceding the adoption of the head of the agency by a Chinese national. So I think, again, there is this kind of question mark about the way in which the UN in general engages, just as you and Jacques have noted, and without the presence of Chinese nationals heading particular agencies. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
If I could just follow up a little bit on that. So, I mean, I think sort of the fallout of 2758 and what China has recently tried to make of it, as Courtney suggests. I mean, it really is sort of a case study in the way this works. She's noted the presence of Chinese nationals at staff positions, albeit in smaller numbers than one might expect, but especially at quite senior levels. And she mentioned the UNGA process, and so that's sort of the link in many ways here, in that part of China's expansion of a focus on legal arguments concerning 2758 is this Office of Legal Affairs memorandum from within the UN in 2010, which gets into the nomenclature issue that Courtney just alluded to. That is, how is Taiwan to be referred to? And this document says that in UN documents, Taiwan is to be referred to as Taiwan, province of China. And the UN has the authority to decide how to refer to anybody in its own documents, but there was an attempt to sort of leverage this more broadly. And so when Courtney refers to the DESA process, that memorandum, which China likes to cite from the Office of Legal Affairs, sort of worked its way through the bureaucracy. And so it's sort of a whisper down the lane story. And once you get to implementing bureaucrats somewhere in DESA, they have this sense that there is a one China principle adopted via 2758. So they stopped accepting postings by member states that referred to Taiwan as something other than Taiwan, province of China. But ultimately, even in the memo that China likes to cite, the resolution within the UN was that documents received from member states must be reproduced as written. And if they use the wrong language, well, so be it. That's the privilege of member states. And UNGA ultimately reversed itself and has started posting those again. But to sort of circle back to Courtney's point, what you've got is a situation where the UN and other similar agencies or entities are fertile ground for what China wants to do, because these are one state, one vote arrangements. The Global South tends not to view Taiwan as a terribly salient issue, and so it's no real cost to signing on to China. China is pretty relentless in pushing its view within the UN system and with other member states. Taiwan's not at the table to push back against it. And so you put all that together and it becomes sort of an arena in which it's possible to push this agenda. And I think that's one of the reasons you see China leaning heavily on 2758 and UN institutions as a sort of basis for pressing its current agenda on Taiwan's international status.
And so if I understand you right, it sort of creates an echo chamber where even though states aren't necessarily obligated to follow some type of dictates, they can refer to Taiwan as they wish. If many of them just refer to Taiwan as a province of China in their documents going through the UN, that just kind of creates a sort of diplomatic momentum that has real world impacts on Taiwan. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I think it's the way other states talk about it. It's the way international organizations, civil servants talk about it. It sort of seeps in as part of the background sense. So if you wind up talking to people who are not deeply immersed in these issues, even within the UN system, they go, yeah, we have a one China principle. China includes Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. And obviously that's beneficial to the position that China would like the world to accept. It's just, it's a favorable arena.
And Courtney, you mentioned, China has several other initiatives that, while they are somewhat modeled on sort of UN dictates, it's just China sort of producing its own vision for global governance. Is your sense that China still prefers to try to get greater leadership positions and more influence over the United Nations and really elevate the UN as the key focal point of global governance, just given its success so far in enhancing its influence? Or is your sense that as China faces more pushback or it has more failures, like with the telecommunications leadership position, that it'll pivot and say, okay, well, actually, we're going to really dial up the importance, whether it's through Belt and Road, whether it's through the Global Security Initiative, what have you. So in other words, I've heard a lot of debate, China, some people say China's trying to set up like a parallel global governance system, where there's other people argue that, well, China's actually trying to go work through existing institutions and bend them in a way that suits Chinese interests. These things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but do you detect a sense of prioritization from Beijing in terms of its broader strategy?
No, that's a great question, Mike. And I think you're right. It's not mutually exclusive. I think we can definitely track the interest in sort of parallel institution building, the use of South-South platforms, springing up now on a variety of functional issues, the upgrading of cybersecurity dialogues to now become annual conferences, to now become institutional foci themselves. But I think it's very important to remember that when it comes to hard problems of peace and security, organizing through some type of alliance network, coalition of the willing, flexible, functional, specific rapid reaction forces, for example, China is not like NATO, the US, or the EU. It only has one particular platform that has this type of teeth in peace and security issues, and that is coming through its very particular power and authority as a permanent member with a veto. So I think it's very clear to me at this point that China is interested in parallel spaces, regional initiatives, but these initiatives have to fall into, again, the view that China projects itself as a true multilateralist with real respect for the UN Charter, and that is the key baseline document. Incidentally, Jacques is very right in saying the sort of legal language, this faith now that Resolution 2758, the One China principle, a singular One China policy is a baseline international norm, is also part of this UN-related verbiage. But I think while we think about this, Mike, it's important to note that there is variation in the means in which China is looking to help realize these different global public goods, as they call them. So GDI has a focal point through DESA. There is a formal group of friends. There is a sub-fund that you can apply to for ballpark 10 million US dollars a year. They can funnel money that they've already been funneling into the SDGs and rehat this as GDI funding. So there's formal mechanisms to make GDI appear more fixed and real. GSI is a fascinating case, if I'll just give you that brief example, in the sense that their concept paper on GSI, there's 20 functional areas. 8 specifically name UN agencies, the United Nations, the UN Charter. Over half of these are really topics discussed in multilateral transnational security issues, so from peacekeeping, global health, biosecurity, etc. But GSI has had a very light footprint in the UN system. They've rehatted an existing $10 million trust fund as now being an example of a GSI project, but we also have to be realistic. 10 million US dollars a year in the UN system does not get you very far. And otherwise, they've only had 2 or 3 references via the Chinese ambassador when he is now assuming the seat as the rotating president of the UN Security Council. So I think we're kind of waiting to see GSI's entry into the UN system, despite this sort of prep work that would lead us to believe that it could be coming. I think the entry point forward is a lot less unclear. So to answer the last part of your question, the short answer is no. I do think there will still be continuing interest by China to find the right type of leadership post to compete for, whether or not they compete to win now, whether or not they're learning through the process of competition. So the real competition could be a decade from now. I think that's something that's unclear from the research standpoint. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Well, just as China has initiatives outside the UN, and we'll see to what extent it's able to integrate those into the UN system. Jacques, in your report for the German Marshall Fund on this issue, you actually describe how Beijing has tried to extend the reach of UN Resolution 2758 beyond the UN into other international forums. So could you elaborate on some of those examples where either China has succeeded or not succeeded, and whether there's any rhyme or reason to that basic pattern?
So I think it kind of operates at two levels. One is that, as we've been discussing here, 2758 is put into this broader package of China's assertion that it is a fact about the world, and one that China wants other states to accept, that the Taiwan question is settled as a matter of international law and Taiwan is part of China. And so if you look at the kind of linkage from 2758 to the broader position, you see these not fully articulated positions that say when the U.S. goes against 2758, when it goes against a one China principle, it is in effect acting contrary to a principle of international law and international relations. And so if you dig into that, and this isn't so much in official statements, but in sort of Chinese orthodox commentaries, you start to get this sense that that China is claiming that it has made sufficient headway here, that this is essentially a principle of customary international law binding on all states regardless of any particular UN action or any particular treaty type arrangement. So that's sort of the high level, almost theory level set of arguments. And then there are very concrete things. So what we've seen recently is 2758 surfacing in particular moves at the international level that reduced Taiwan's space. So when Nauru switched diplomatic recognition, the latest switch just happened right after the Taiwanese presidential election in January. Nauru switched from Taipei to Beijing. That was, at this point, I think, still a unique instance of citing 2758 and the One China principle that it embodies as the basis for shifting diplomatic relations. So it wasn't so much a choice, it was kind of required by a fact about law and the world. Taiwan also lost its kind of observer status at Parlacen, the Association of Central American Parliaments, where again 2758 was cited as the basis. But this has been going on for a while. Back when at the sort of the height of the controversy about the UN, and including the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time, saying that the UN viewed Taiwan as, for all intents and purposes, a part of China. Obviously Beijing welcomed that, but they also at that point started sending notes around to other international organizations in Geneva, including those that are not within the UN framework and therefore would not be bound by the 2758 or the legal advice interpreting it, saying we assume you will all follow this too and not engage with Taiwan on any basis other than it being part of China. And you see it occasionally in more informal bilateral statements. There was just one from Malaysia where 2758 was invoked and so on. So it's sort of seeping out into this broader diplomatic practice. Now there are cases of pushback. Right after the Ban Ki-moon reference to China being, for all intents and purposes, something that includes Taiwan, we saw the U.S. push back with a non-paper where it said if the UN keeps accepting this Chinese position that Taiwan can only be referred to as a province of China and keeps accepting this notion that 2758 somehow settled the question, then the U.S. will be compelled to dissociate itself from the UN's position. And then we saw a sort of smaller scale version of that when Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Mark Lambert made remarks about what 2758 does not do, remarks he made actually at the launch of this report. So we got a little pushback from Chinese diplomatic representatives to the U.S. State Department for what China viewed as an improper characterization of 2758 as leaving the Taiwan question unsettled.
Can you actually elaborate, because we've talked about China's one China principle, and for those of us that aren't following these issues as closely as the two of you, I'm sure people have heard of the United States' one China policy, and you just mentioned that there was this clash between American diplomats and those from Beijing. So can you just explain how the U.S. one China policy is different from this one China principle? Because I think that'll clarify some of the diplomatic stakes here.
The problem with that question is neither side has a single authoritative formulation of its position, so there's no particular U.S. statement of its one China policy or China's statement of its one China principle, although there's something closer to the latter. So the origins of the U.S. one China policy really go back at least to the establishment or the movement toward establishment of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and the PRC at the end of the 1970s. And so if you look at the three U.S.-China joint communiques, particularly the first one, and the second one sort of picks up on this, the U.S. says that it acknowledges the Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The U.S. doesn't challenge that. And that, of course, was the position at the time. As I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, one of the weaknesses of Taiwan's position on this is that at the time that 2758 was adopted, they too agreed that Taiwan was definitively part of China, and it's a question of which government. But note that the U.S. acknowledges that position. It doesn't recognize it. It doesn't accept it. It says it doesn't challenge it. But it's sort of saying, you guys both agree on this, so we're not going to mess. And of course, many years have gone by since then, and so there are other formulations. One of the more famous ones is President Clinton's 3 no's when he was visiting China, saying the U.S. does not recognize 2 Chinas, it does not support Taiwan independence, and it does not support Taiwan's efforts to join international organizations in which statehood is a requirement of membership. In other words, the UN and a handful of others. So that's kind of a negative definition, right? It's not this, and perhaps the most sort of characteristic formulation is one that the Assistant Secretary for East Asia Pacific, James Kelly, mentioned back in 2004, where he said, in response to a congressional question, that the U.S. One China policy isn't something he really defined in answer to the question, as he said. It's just that our One China policy is not Beijing's One China principle. Okay, so we know what it's not. And it does have these limits of not supporting independence and not supporting Taiwan's membership in state member-only organizations. And basically, I think it boils down to the U.S. position is that it has not recognized that the PRC definitively has sovereignty over Taiwan. On the other hand, the U.S. has not recognized Taiwan as a full-fledged state entity, and the U.S. at some level considers this unsettled, although you won't find too many definitive statements on that. And Mark Lambert's statements too were what 2758 does not do rather than what it does do. So the U.S. has left this kind of ambiguous. China's position's a little clearer. It basically is that the PRC is the sole legitimate government of all of China, that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, or sometimes an inalienable part of the People's Republic of China, that there are no 2 Chinas, no one China, one Taiwan, and no Taiwan independence. And we've also seen, particularly in the cross-strait context, China insisting that any leader in Taiwan must acknowledge the One China principle and the so-called 92 consensus, which is a retroactive description by one of Ma Ying-jeou, then President Ma Ying-jeou's senior advisors, who basically said that the dialogue in 92 reached this consensus, which was that there was one China, but we disagree about what it meant. So a lot of mess there, but what it basically comes down to is the PRC saying, as a matter of its One China principle, and now trying to interpret 2758 as accepting broadly internationally the One China principle, is there's one China, it includes Taiwan. Taiwan has no separate status, it's basically a province. And the US saying, hold on a minute, you all can work it out. If you have a common opinion, fine, but short of that, we're going to essentially say that we don't accept China's position and we don't accept Taiwan independence, and we view it as, to some degree, unsettled.
Yeah, negative association, I think, makes the world go round. I'm going to try that acknowledge thing in my personal life when I have a disagreement with someone. I acknowledge that you think that, but it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it. We'll see how far that goes.
Courtney, I hear that you're talking, and if anything I said I offended you, I'm terribly sorry.
Yes, okay, well, yeah. Yes, this is how we wake up alive the next day. Okay, so Courtney, I know your research focuses on China's strategy in global governance, but I was wondering if you could say a bit more about Taiwan and the challenges it faces, not just in the UN, but really in the international community in general, trying to gain any kind of meaningful participation in international institutions. It seems like just one of the obstacles is this very convoluted debate about its status and what it is, and what even some of its backers are willing to state. So are there any recent examples where you think Taiwan has actually made some significant strides despite Beijing's opposition and growing clout in global governance?
I think I'd put it this way, Mike. I mean, I think the conversation, that Jacques is really alluding to is that 2758 is no longer in isolation, and it is escaping and being applied across multiple spaces, in the sense well outside the UN setting now. And I think at the same time, I think Taiwanese diplomats are also very clear that they are pursuing space for Taiwan that goes well beyond whatever type of meaningful participation in IOs that they can achieve. And so I think it's very interesting to watch, Taiwan's acceptance and its, legal merging with a variety of international legal instruments on human rights, for example, et cetera. Their ability to make the case that Taiwan is able to support international efforts to address global governance problems. So the very sort of powerful messaging coming out from Taiwan during COVID, that Taiwan is able to establish best practices, that it knows how to export PPE. It has thought about the social dimension that comes up when you're dealing with long periods of isolation for COVID procedures. I think things like this also help make the case that Taiwan itself is also a good standing member of the international community. We can also watch all of the efforts of sort of power diplomacy. So I'll come back to that in a minute. And I think also it's fascinating if we watch just the recent news, the spat going on about who can hold which type of towel saying what type of word at the Olympics, right? As an Olympic ticket holder just watching the games. I think it's very interesting to pay attention to what's going on also in other parts of Paris, where the Taiwanese representation has worked very hard to establish its Paris Cultural Olympiad. And so the view that Taiwan may not be a name you can use inside the Olympics, but Taiwan is certainly around the Olympic fever, and Taiwan is there too. I think it's just a few things to also remember, though, that as much as we focus on this sort of pressure on Taiwan seeking some type of international space for itself, I think we are sort of entering a new point, which I'd be very interested to hear Jacques' view too, and your view also, Mike, on whether or not we are sort of witnessing a little bit now of this Streisand effect. I think more that Chinese officials hold the line and they will push very hard for what they have repeated many times as a core interest for China, managing this Taiwan question. We also see that, when Edinburgh decided to no longer pursue its sister city effort with Kaohsiung back in June, there was a whole spate of international reporting on this. And I think really getting attention that people will read a 2-minute piece on the BBC and think, oh, I'd never thought about this. Like, why would the city in Scotland be worried about the way that China would respond to having a sister city relationship, right? Where you do cultural and educational exchange, business exchange. Why would this be something? And I think the same image when you see IOC officials confiscating signs and things like this, that it again focuses attention, and you go back and you read the newspaper and you think, oh, well, what's that about? And so I do wonder about how this is starting to change the way in which China's footprint is being received. And so I do wonder about that Streisand effect, but I'll stop there.
Jacques, do you want to comment on that? Do you see
Yeah.
these kind of resounding effects?
Yeah, love the Streisand effect. But to pick up on a couple of threads that Courtney raised there. One is, where does Taiwan seek to succeed here? Some of it is portraying itself as a good international citizen, right? And she alluded to some examples of that. And in the specifically international law context, you see attempts to say, we're following the rules-based international order, we're a good citizen, we play by the rules, and an implicit and sometimes explicit contrast with the way Taiwan depicts what the mainland is up to. So you can see that in the law of the sea issues in the South China Sea, you can see it in human rights and so on. The other thing that Courtney pointed to that's worth underscoring is that Taiwan's strategy in contexts where it has been excluded, it's not allowed to join the UN human rights covenants, it's not allowed to join the law of the sea convention and things like that because of China's opposition and Taiwan's own lack of acknowledged statehood status. So what it does is say, we're going to act as if we are a member of that structure. It happens with the UNFCCC on climate change. So in all these areas, there's a sort of performative element of saying, we're acting as if we're a full-fledged member of these institutions, we bring it into our domestic law, we do reports that resemble what a member state would be required to do under treaty. So all these things are sort of ratchet up the status. But I would agree there is a Streisand effect element here in that China, by being so relentless on this and pressing basically every time this pops up, it's a bit of a whack-a-mole, right? That is, every time something seems to be an apostasy in Beijing's view from an international organization or perhaps from another state, especially a less powerful state, or an NGO, there's pushback against it. But I think it has created increasingly this sense that Beijing's a bit of a bully. And that it's sort of pushing people around, and it is, in a sense, despite a rhetorical and I think policy position where China has, as Courtney alluded to at the top of her remarks, pushed this notion of sovereign statehood, right? A state-based system. You don't mess around in my internal affairs. And when you see things like going after American hotel chains or airlines for referring to Taiwan as something other than a province of China, suggesting its country status, going after sister city relationships or towels at the Olympics, that becomes just this sort of bad narrative of mucking around in others' internal affairs, and I think it has created that kind of pushback. And I think that's especially strong where it's under the shadow of growing concerns in some polities that China is essentially adopting pieces of the Russian model of interfering in domestic politics and democratic entities. Obviously, Taiwan's been a target of that. It's been an issue in Australia, as Courtney knows better than where basically this is not just a symbolic thing, which I think does resonate with broader publics, but it also has this domestic political dimension.
Courtney, do you share that assessment? So, looking at this issue from New York, I mean, the number of times I've seen the newspaper, tagline, in a move likely to anger China, or, something, or when the Chinese diplomats are saying that you've hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. And there just seems to be increasing number of incidents where China is showing some pretty thin skin, and as Jacques said, is coming across as a bully. But do you think do you share that broader assessment is catching on around the world? I've seen some of the public opinion polls, to the extent that they're useful, suggesting that China's image around the world is not doing particularly well, at least in the West, and maybe parts beyond the West. But do you share that assessment? And if so, do you think that has resonated within Beijing, and that there is sort of a course correction? And I guess, how do you see China's strategy evolving if that is in fact the case, that it needs to be seen as less heavy-handed, less of a bully? How does it maneuver under that kind of situation?
I mean, I think I would like to note again that whenever I hear that line, that, the hurt feelings of the Chinese people, I'm always curious. I would like to always ask the diplomat, like, well, where's your survey data? I would love to read this. So I feel like sometimes that's a tagline used and we all kind of accept it that we've heard it, but I would actually like to see, where is your Pew Center equivalent poll? I think the interesting thing about the Pew polling, if we think back to what we've seen the last couple of years, is that, overall, China has taken a hit. I think the polling last year showed that the direct association between Xi Jinping and sort of being a negative player in global politics, that has really markedly gone up by polling across a variety of countries. But the interesting point, though, is that a select number of states in the global south do view China actually relatively popularly, especially, I guess, in our patch of the world sitting here in Sydney, especially compared against Australia, India, and Japan. So I think that's some really fascinating polling data that's come out from Pew this year. But I think, again, it's important to remember that as much as, a number of relationships that China wants to seek to repair, I think we are perhaps also looking at sort of this view that we're in a phase of repair while still struggling. So I think there's a lot of this trying to figure out exactly what the good relationship looks like, as China also wants to hold the line. I think it's also important to note that as much as China says it's a fundamental sovereignty issue, and that these 11 states plus the Vatican that recognize Taiwan, that this is erroneous, China is able to moderate its appetite for picking off Taiwanese recognition. And funnily enough, that has helped to be moderated by which party comes to power in Taiwan. So I think, again, there is an air of pragmatism, as much as we're told that this is a core interest, that this is a very principled position, an underlying international norm of international politics, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'll be very interested to see whether or not there is this sort of feedback loop. If I can just cite one last thing that I do think is interesting. I think there is this question about to what extent feedback is public or private to Chinese diplomats. And I think it is a very important point to note that in June of this year, the US-Taiwan working group on IOs did meet. They publicized their meeting. They put out a very short, paragraph statement about it, which they talked about cooperation, meaningful participation on issues of food security, aviation security, international public health, and climate. And I think, again, that's a very implicit reminder to remind Beijing that, you can have things discussed in public, or you can have non-papers written in private that then end up coming out public. But you also have to pick your poison when you push and push. So I think there is that sort of diplomacy ballet that is still ongoing.
Yeah, I think it's worth underscoring that we do see the spectrum. There is lots of quiet pushback that doesn't see the light of day. Some of that surfaces obliquely in UN documents. Somebody does a memo or something about some meeting. But what we have seen is, I think, more consideration, particularly in the US, of more public pushback. So that, as Courtney points out, the non-paper is this sort of halfway house, right? It was clearly released to the public but not put out as a formal document. And the Lambert statement about 2758 and what it doesn't do, I mean, these are signs of going a bit more public, which the pushback, and I'm sure the private conversations are, you keep doing this, we're going to ratchet up the more pointed public statements. And indeed, that was sort of the last line of the 2007 non-paper, was if the UN keeps doing this, the US is going to be forced to publicly dissociate itself from those positions.
And then Mike, can I just add one more example? Sorry. I think it is important, as we think about this, that there are these moments, I think, that do grab attention, and I would assume lead to some type of feedback. So I'll read the quote. In September of 2023, the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed was asked a question directly relating to Taiwan in the context of her session that she was holding relating to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by the 2030 deadline, in which DSG Mohammed, and I read the quote directly, she replied that every person matters, whether it's Taiwan or otherwise, and I think it's really important for member states to find a solution. Now, UN officials are also excellent diplomats. It was perhaps ambiguous what the find a solution was referring to. Were you talking about something about Taiwan's meaningful participation? Are you talking about achieving SDGs? But Chinese officials were very quick to seek clarification and make sure that there was clarification publicly put out via the UN spokesperson, etc., clarifying that the UN had gone back, exactly as Jacques notes, to accepting the One China principle. But I think moments like this really focus attention, and you ask yourself, well, how does this help if China's making the claim that it is so anxious to help support all of these 2030 SDG goals? If there's a group of people, there's 20-something million people that can be left out of this, then what does this really mean about the way that China's thinking about its power politics, its great power position, as it goes around explaining itself as a true multilateralist, defending the UN Charter and providing global public goods? So I think, again, there is this particular push and shove that does come at cost, and I think will be difficult for PRC diplomats to have to reconcile, because there are multiple audiences domestically. That type of pushback will sell well. But I think within a UN setting, a number of states will look at that moment and realize, like, there's a hard line here that they can't quite explain to us. And I think that leads to, further difficult conversation too. I'll stop there.
I was actually going to try to expand the conversation now we've talked a lot about US strategy and the US position within the UN and starting to push back. Are there any other major actors that you see really becoming a player in this space, whether it's certain European countries or Japan or what have you? Maybe Jacques, I'll go to you, but I also want to hear, Courtney, from you, if you see other major countries really starting to push back on Beijing's interpretations here, or just its influence in the UN more broadly.
Well, the most strident pushback, not surprisingly, has come from what we would call very much not great powers. It's the now remaining dozen of 11 states plus the Vatican that do push quite hard within the UN context and elsewhere to say, 2758 doesn't do what China says it does, and it's a misreading. In fact, they do some quite extensive and pointed commentaries on how the Office of Legal Affairs, in their view, got it wrong, and the Secretary General is getting terrible legal advice and that sort of thing. So they've been quite zealous about it. The U.S. has, not surprisingly, given that it's Taiwan's principal international backer, probably been second in line for forcefulness of statements, and obviously it's more weighty when the U.S. does it. But I think you're starting to see more and more of that. I mean, Taiwan is now getting mentioned in bilateral statements by the U.S. president with counterparts from Asia. We've seen it with Japan. We've seen it with Korea. You've started to see European statements, EU-type statements that take the Taiwan issue more seriously, and that sort of express concern about things that are destabilizing the region and threatening peace and security, and that's a European interest too. Of course, there are sort of implications, I think, from the security structures that we're seeing starting to go into place in the Western Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, AUKUS and the Quad. I mean, these aren't explicitly by any means Taiwan-focused, but clearly they are driven by contingencies that are related to how China is behaving in the region, and the sense that Taiwan is obviously the frontline entity. And it gets stray remarks here and there, but I think we don't have a coordinated response yet. And one of the things that comes out in this report is the question of trying to avoid this looking like just a U.S.-China bilateral issue, and for the purposes of identifying and in some ways pushing back against what the U.S. and others see as a Chinese challenge to status quo norms. This is one point of entry into that broader discussion. But I don't think we'll see a huge shift in terms of more formal support for Taiwan. It's more invoking principles of maintaining existing rules and of, as Courtney's last remarks alluded to, notions of universal representation, including the 23 million people who live in Taiwan and things like that.
Courtney?
I mean, I think the different subset of states to also remember, I think to pay attention to, just as Jacques notes, sort of the dozen states that are still able to try and apply and push back because of course they recognize the ROC. I think there is also this question of sort of the role of these big UN funders. So Japan and various EU states will fall into the top 10. And remember, in the UN system, funding matters. Money helps move authority. Money helps also help facilitate relationships. And so I think if these states are willing to engage, and I think it will also shift conversation. I think there's also something that we are sort of in the mood looking at now, that it's no longer just about Resolution 2758 as a question mark itself. I think we are entering a point, and certainly a lot of the public, reporting, the narrative that's now shifted in the last sort of decade or so about sort of China's UN arrival. And the understanding that Chinese officials have that the UN doesn't just do day-to-day global governance, it actually will help set the rules. So the ability to help run UN agencies, you can adopt the authority, the prestige, the legitimacy of having your views as now infused as a UN view. And I think that awareness now is helping to shape the way that you're hearing conversation about Resolution 2758. It's indicative of China's ability to push its own line. And therefore, this is something that is of note now. I think in a way that before maybe Resolution 2758 was viewed as solely its own singular question mark about Taiwan as a bilateral spat between the US and China as a cross-strait relations issue. I think that view now that China's kind of come for the UN and they're sort of a large, important player has now put Resolution 2758 in that sort of space where you now think about pushback, conversation, because it's saying something much larger about China's influence and beyond sort of managing Taiwan.
So we've talked a lot in institutional and procedural terms and in terms of China's diplomatic strategy. And for just the last part of our conversation, I wanted to broaden it out and talk a bit about the extent to which you think things going on in the broader balance of power internationally are affecting either China's ability to push its own narratives in global governance. And then we can talk about the reverse effects, how China's diplomatic strategy is then affecting the international balance of power. But on the first sort of relationship, I'm just wondering, China, does the fact that it's carrying out these large shows of force in the Taiwan Strait and people are starting to worry about a major war in the Taiwan Strait, does that change things in terms of diplomatic outcomes, either within the United Nations or in other international institutions where countries are starting to maybe reassess their position on some of these issues in light of a broader security threat they feel is coming from Beijing? Or, we talked about how China, Courtney, you mentioned how China is still quite popular in parts of the so-called global South, or in a country like Australia where there's a lot of economic benefits, to be having a good relationship with Beijing. But does China's economic troubles, coupled with its pumping up of its export industries and flooding global markets, does that change the nature of the game, or the fact that Chinese loans are not being dispersed as prolifically as they were, say, in 2016, 2017? And a lot of countries on the Belt and Road are under debt distress right now. I mean, do any of these broader geopolitical, military, economic factors shape some of the diplomatic outcomes that we're seeing, or some of the strategies that are at play? I want to hear from both of you on this, but maybe I'll start with you, Courtney, and then we'll go to Jacques.
Thanks, Mike. It's a great set of questions. And I think the short answer is yes. As I've alluded to, the different pathways in which these global initiatives are being fed into the UN system, I think it's unsurprising that GSI is having at the moment a very light touch. I think Chinese diplomats are aware that this is a very sensitized, obviously securitized space to try and add more sort of PRC input. And certainly the context of China's sort of fence sitting on the Ukraine war, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has shaped the way in which I think engagement can occur. I think at the same time, if you look at all of sort of the regional efforts, as Jacques discussed, right, Quad related, Alsman literally is about to wrap up efforts with AUKUS, I think there is certainly much more awareness now about sort of harder cooperative security arrangements are underfoot. And I think this also helps in many ways shape the space multilaterally in the way that China can sort of try and project and explain itself. We also should pay attention, I think, to the way in which sort of the broader debate about the economic security, technological innovation, and the way that it shapes future security outcomes. So, of course, all of this discussion of chip wars, I cannot believe we've made it this far through and we've not mentioned semiconductors. But I think, again, that's also shaping the way that China is trying to shape what the rules and the norms and the procedures and principles of these emerging global governance issues are. So very much China's view on its global initiative on data security, the global initiative on AI governance. These haven't made it into sort of the big three or the 3+ BRI, but they're certainly working on these initiatives now through the UN system. And China is trying to project its views on the way that it believes data should move, on the way in which AI governance structures should be built, again, unsurprisingly, state-based, state-focused. And so I think, again, there is a lot of discussion on broader security issues and a lot of very keen diplomacy following this. There was a lot of work done. Most recently, a resolution passed without vote, so it's just adopted unanimously within the General Assembly, so very atypical for the P5 to be working within the General Assembly space. The US had a by-consensus resolution adopted on AI governance. And then shortly thereafter, China really pushed to make sure its resolution on AI governance and capacity building could also be accepted. And a lot of deft diplomacy to make sure that human rights language would be added back into those drafts. So I think, if anything, the emerging debate in general global politics, international relations news is certainly shaping, I think, China's movements within the UN space. Thanks.
Jacques, do you want to add on to that? Are you seeing similar relationships between the two?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a lot of this. I mean, just to since we're our last couple of minutes here to sort of take a step back on some of this. I mean, it is not at all unusual for rising powers to want to shape international rules in ways that are aligned with their preferences and interests. I mean, that's a typical thing to see happening, and China's been doing that. But of course, that creates frictions. And the game now is figuring out just how to assess what China is doing. As Courtney describes, China is portraying itself as a provider of public goods, a good multilateralist, and all of that. And on the obverse side is portraying the U.S. as trying to contain China and keep China down. That's obviously a narrative about who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, and that's inevitable. But a lot of what we've been talking about is getting a bit into the weeds on particular rules. And China has, as Courtney points out, leaned toward the more statist side. The U.S. is not as internationalist perhaps as it used to be, but there is this ongoing struggle about how to shape those rules. And one of the things that China faces as there is a sense that it is asserting things that serve its interests and preferences in ways that may not align with those of the U.S. and others, is just how much China is a problematic actor here. And so the things where it looks most assertive, indeed perhaps aggressive, on issues like Taiwan, we see a lot of an effort to say, actually, we're not the bad guys here. So China is saying we're just trying to prevent the secession of Taiwan and it's drifting away. The U.S. would be upsetting the international order if it came in and supported Taiwan's separate status and so on. So it's an attempt, I think, for China to push issues that are high priority for it, including Taiwan, but many others, in ways that say the status quo and the legal rules support China's positions and not the other side's positions. So we're seeing this kind of lawfare almost, right? And so there's this claim that if you accept, to get back to our initial topic here, the notion that 2758 or something establishes that Taiwan is part of China, then Taiwan and the U.S. are the disruptors. China is the protector of the status quo rules. So I think we're going to see that kind of dialogue going on. That gets you so far. I mean, beneath this lie, of course, rather hard assessments of national interests, which will drive a lot of what goes on in this area. And normative and legal principles can help somewhat to either side, but won't decide the questions.
And Jacques, just to take us out, could you talk a bit about in sort of real on the ground terms what it would mean if the international community were to increasingly accept Beijing's interpretation of Resolution 2758? Like, what would you say to a hard-headed realist that says, these international institutions, they don't really matter, and at the end of the day, countries will either do business or not with Taiwan based on their strategic interests, and this is not going to really affect broader security dynamics either in the Taiwan Strait or certainly not more broadly throughout East Asia? What would be some of the real world effects, you think, if this diplomatic strategy continues to be successful on Beijing's part?
Well, not to get all sort of idealistic about what international legal norms here do, but they do a decent job of tracking some norms of international politics. And to just take an analogy that's getting kind of dated these days, if Saddam were to get assertive, would you rather be the Iraqi Kurds or Kuwait? You'd rather be Kuwait, right? So the idea is, to the extent that Taiwan strategy and some U.S. support for Taiwan makes it look more like a state, such that coercion cross straits would be akin to an invasion and a takeover of another state, that tends to facilitate a cooperative international reaction against that sort of behavior. But where if it's just putting down or repressing a somewhat dissident or separatist internal group, we tend to look the other way. And all states have an interest in those principles being accepted. They're built into the UN Charter and much international law and international norms. They're not always honored, but it tells you something that Putin has tried to depict Ukraine as not a real state, right? It makes it okay to do that kind of thing. So these things matter at the margins. They matter in terms of framing, and that's some of the battle we're seeing going on here. So are legal rules going to decide this? No, but they do tend to track certain understandable norms about how when we consider coercive or aggressive actions problematic internationally, and when we do not. One final thing I'll say on this is that I think it is important to caution Beijing that even if you are to accept the position that Taiwan is definitively part of China for all intents and purposes, just a province and so on, that doesn't mean it's no longer an issue of international concern. States will still have interests, and even in terms of some of the legal and normative principles we've been talking about, you don't get to do whatever you want, right? There are human rights constraints, there are constraints about how you use force even domestically, and ultimately, and this is one of the things I think that has made China particularly concerned about developments in Taiwan's own domestic politics is if Taiwanese increasingly think of themselves as a people separate from the Chinese people, that is something at odds with that old 1971, 1972 position that there's Chinese on both sides of the strait, then you get into these notions of self-determination and separatism, which has created a lot of strife in the world and probably will continue to do so.
Well, Jacques deLisle signing in from Taiwan. Thank you for waking up bright and early to enlighten us. Courtney Fung, thank you so much also for waking up bright and early in Australia. This was a really great conversation. And thanks to all of you that tuned in. We'll be posting this online so that folks that weren't able to attend live can get some of the insights that we brought out here. Thank you so much to everyone that was involved in supporting FPRI. And we hope to have both Jacques and Courtney back at some time in the future to follow up on this very important and pressing issue. Good night. Good morning. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.